The smell of burnt toast shouldn't accompany a resurrection. Yet, here I am, breathing in the bitter charcoal scent of my cramped kitchen, alive. 10 minutes from now, a man in a $3,000 suit will knock on that peeling door to offer me the world. A lost heir, a billion-dollar empire, a fairy tale. Last time, I took the crown and inherited a death sentence. This time, I'm going to hand it to the man who ruined me. The first thing I noticed wasn't a blinding light or a choir of angels. It was the hum of the refrigerator, that awful, rhythmic rattling sound it made when the compressor was dying, vibrating against the cheap linoleum floor of the apartment. I sucked in a breath. My lungs expanded fully. No sharp, jagged stabbing in my lower left side. No wet, heavy gurgle in my throat. I pressed my palms against my ribs, digging my fingers into the skin through my thin cotton t-shirt. Whole, solid, unbroken, just hours ago, or maybe a lifetime ago, depending on how the physics of this hellish universe worked. A man named Victor had shattered 3 of those ribs with a standard-issue aluminum baseball bat. I remembered the metallic ping it made upon impact, followed by the dull, wet crunch of my own bones giving way. I remembered the taste of rust and copper in my mouth, the cold concrete of the parking garage pressing against my cheek, and the absolute, crushing silence of the phone in my pocket. Gavin hadn't picked up. He was already on a flight to Geneva with the last $500,000 of clean cash we had. He had left me holding the bag. I sat up on the sagging mattress, the springs groaning in protest. The air in the apartment was thick and stale, smelling faintly of cheap vanilla vape juice and the burnt toast Gavin was currently scraping into the sink in the kitchen. "You're up late," Gavin called out over his shoulder. I could see him through the open doorway. He was wearing his crisp, white dress shirt, the one he bought on credit because he said he needed to dress for the job he wanted, not the job he had. He was meticulously scraping the charred edges off a piece of cheap, white bread. I just stared at him. The broad shoulders, the perfectly styled hair he spent 40 minutes on every morning. The man I had loved for 3 years. The man who would, in exactly 2 years' time, sign legal documents transferring liability for a massive offshore syndicate debt entirely into my name, just before disappearing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Rowan," he said, turning around. He took a bite of the dry toast and grimaced. "Did you sleep in your clothes?" "Yeah," I rasped. My voice sounded foreign to me. Too young, too unbroken. "Yeah, I was tired." "Well, get it together. I have that interview at the gallery at noon. I need you to iron my gray slacks." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't care. In my past life, I had thought his self-absorption was a quirk, a byproduct of us growing up with nothing in the foster system. I used to think he was just driven. I didn't realize, until it was far too late, that he viewed me the same way he viewed the iron he wanted me to use. As a tool. I stood up. The floor was cold. Everything was so intensely real. The sticky residue on the counter, the dripping faucet, the stack of past due utility bills held down by a cheap ceramic mug. Today was the day. I glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. 9:45 m. In exactly 15 minutes, Richard Caldwell, senior partner at Caldwell and Hayes, would knock on our door. He would ask for Rowan Thorne. He would present a velvet box, a faded orphanage intake form, and a silver Zippo lighter engraved with the Montgomery family crest. He would tell me that the billionaire patriarch, Wallace Montgomery, had spent 3 decades looking for his illegitimate son. In my past life, I had wept. Gavin had held me, his eyes wide with the dollar signs flashing in his head. We thought we had won the lottery. We moved into the penthouse, bought the cars, signed the endless stacks of paperwork Caldwell shoved in front of us, establishing my legal identity as the sole heir and managing director of the Montgomery Trust. It took 18 months for the illusion to crack. The Montgomery Empire wasn't a business. It was a front, a massive, rotting carcass of a company that had been quietly hollowed out by bad investments and then used to launder money for an international cartel. Wallace Montgomery hadn't been looking for a son to pass his legacy to. He had been looking for a scapegoat. He needed a fresh name, a legally binding idiot, to take the title of CEO so that when the FBI and the cartel came collecting, the old man was insulated, and I was the one in the crosshairs. 80 million in missing syndicate funds, 200 million in federal tax evasion. I took the fall. Gavin took the severance package. Rowan? Gavin snapped his fingers in front of my face, pulling me back to the present. The slacks? Are you deaf this morning? I'll get to them, I muttered, brushing past him. I walked into the cramped bathroom and locked the door. I turned on the cold water and splashed it over my face. The shock of the temperature grounded me. I looked in the mirror. No dark circles, no hollowed cheeks, no split lip, just a 24-year-old kid with tired eyes. Under the sink, behind a bottle of generic bleach and a stack of threadbare towels, was a loose floorboard. I knelt down on the cold tile and pried it up with my fingernails. Beneath it sat a small tin box. Inside was my birth certificate, smeared and faded, and the heavy silver Zippo lighter I had worn on a leather string around my neck when I was dropped at the fire station as a baby. The Montgomery crest was unmistakable, a lion rearing up over a broken sword. I stared at the heavy silver object. To anyone else, it looked like a ticket out of poverty. To me, it felt radioactive. An idea began to form, a dark, cynical seed taking root in the fertile soil of my resentment. Gavin and I were the same age. We were both foundlings from the exact same county system. We had similar builds, similar coloring. Caldwell didn't actually know what the lost heir looked like. He only had the private investigator's report tracking the silver lighter to this specific apartment, in an old intake form from St. Jude's orphanage. The Montgomery family didn't care about DNA. They didn't want a tearful reunion. They wanted a signature on the dotted line of a debt transfer. If someone presented the lighter and claimed the name, they would fast-track the paperwork before the ink could dry. I picked up the tin box. I didn't hide it this time. I carried it out to the living room and set it on the coffee table, right next to Gavin's pristine, overpriced leather portfolio. "What's that?" Gavin asked, pausing mid-chew. "Just some old stuff from the system," I said softly, keeping my eyes cast downward, playing the part of the exhausted, beaten-down boyfriend he expected me to be. I pulled it out looking for my social security card. "I'll put it away later." I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice tightening with irritation. "My pants, Rowan!" "Going to the corner store to get you some actual butter," I lied. "Be back in 10. I walked out the door and let it click shut behind me. I didn't go downstairs. I walked down the dim, carpeted hallway, stopped by the stairwell, and waited, watching the reflection in the dirty window at the end of the hall. I didn't have to wait long. Through the thin walls of the apartment, I could hear the floorboards creaking. Gavin was inherently nosy. He had zero respect for boundaries, always checking my phone when I was in the shower, opening my mail. The tin box on the coffee table was irresistible bait. I leaned against the peeling wallpaper in the stairwell, closing my eyes. I pictured it happening. Gavin opening the tin, the heavy weight of the silver Zippo in his palm. The faded letter from the state detailing the contents found with baby John Doe. A temporary placeholder name before the orphanage dubbed me Rowan. A few minutes passed. I checked my watch. 9:52 a.m. I pushed off the wall and walked back to the apartment, turning the doorknob quietly. When I stepped inside, Gavin was standing over the coffee table. The tin box was open. The lighter was in his hand. His thumb rubbed over the engraved lion, his eyes wide, pupils dilated. He didn't even notice me walk in until I intentionally dropped my keys on the counter. He jumped, his hand snapping shut around the lighter. "Did they have butter?" he asked, his voice an octave higher than usual. "Card got declined," I lied smoothly. "What are you doing in my box?" Gavin swallowed hard. His mind was racing. I could practically see the gears grinding behind his eyes. He looked down at the documents, then back at me. "Rowan, this crest," he started, his voice tight. "Do you know what this is?" "It's just an old lighter." "It's not just an old lighter," Gavin snapped, his usual condescension bleeding through. He stepped closer, holding it up to the harsh overhead light. "This is the Montgomery crest. The real estate Montgomerys. The ones who own half the skyline downtown. So, someone probably stole it and dropped it in my bassinet," I said, keeping my tone dismissive. I walked past him and sat heavily on the couch. "It doesn't mean anything." "It means everything," Gavin practically shouted. He paced the small space between the TV and the couch. The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and bergamot, wafted through the air, clashing horribly with the smell of stale grease. "Rowan, there have been rumors for years in the tabloids. Wallace Montgomery had an illegitimate kid he lost to the state. People have been trying to claim the inheritance for a decade. This is proof." "Proof of what?" I sighed, leaning my head back. "That I might be some billionaire's bastard?" "Gav, even if it's true, I don't want it. Those people are sharks. They'd chew me up and spit me out. I just want a quiet life. I don't want the pressure." That was the magic word. Pressure. Gavin stopped pacing. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, studying me like a bug under a microscope. He was seeing the softness he always accused me of having, the lack of ambition. In his mind, I was weak, unworthy of a golden ticket. "You really don't want it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft whisper. "I'd rather burn it," I muttered. "I'm going to take it to a pawn shop tomorrow. Maybe we can get $50 for the silver." "Are you insane?" Gavin gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging in. "You can't pawn this. This is a key to an empire, Rowan. Millions of dollars. A penthouse. We wouldn't have to worry about rent, about bills, about anything." I said no, Gavin. I stood up, shrugging off his hand. "It's my life. I don't want to be a Montgomery." He stared at me, a dark, opportunistic shadow passing over his handsome face. He looked down at the lighter, then at the faded orphanage intake form. The form didn't say Rowan. It just said, "Male infant, approx 3 months." "Rowan," he said, his tone suddenly shifting. It became smooth, placating, the voice he used when he wanted me to cover his half of the rent. "You're right. You're too gentle for that world. Corporate boardrooms, the press, the scrutiny. It would destroy you." "Exactly," I said, staring at the floor to hide the cold, dead amusement in my eyes. "But," Gavin stepped closer, lowering his voice, "what if you didn't have to deal with it? What if I did? I looked up, feigning shock. What do you mean? We're the same age. We were at the same orphanage before the foster system split us up. No one knows what the kid looks like, Gavin said, the words tumbling out of him fast, desperate. If I took the lighter, if I took the paperwork, you want to steal my identity? I asked, putting just the right amount of betrayal into my voice. It's not stealing if you give it to me, Gavin argued, his hands waving animatedly. Look, I can handle those people. I know how to talk, how to act. I'll take the title. I'll deal with the old man. I'll take the pressure. And when the money clears, I'll take care of you. We'll share it. But I'll be the one taking all the risk. Oh, you have no idea the risk you're taking, I thought. The phantom pain in my ribs throbbed in agreement. That's fraud, Gavin, I whispered, stepping back. If they catch you, you'll go to prison. They won't catch me, he sneered, his vanity taking full control. He straightened his posture, adjusting his cheap cuffs. I look more like a Montgomery than you do anyway. I can pull this off, Rowan. Let me do this. For us. He reached out and grabbed the lighter, clutching it to his chest like a talisman. I don't know. I hesitated, playing the part perfectly. It feels wrong. It's right for us, he insisted. He shoved the lighter into his pocket and carefully folded the intake form. Just, if anyone asks, play dumb. I'll handle the rest. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the apartment door. 3 measured raps. Gavin froze. He looked at the door, then at me. His heart was probably hammering against his ribs. Mine was dead calm. Who is that? Gavin whispered. I don't know, I said quietly. I stepped back and gestured toward the door. But you said you could handle it, right? You're the heir now, Gavin. Go answer your door. Gavin took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and walked to the door. He swung it open, putting on his best charming, confident smile. Standing in the hallway was Richard Caldwell. He looked exactly as I remembered him. Impeccably tailored navy suit, silver hair combed back with expensive pomade, and cold, reptilian eyes that calculated the net worth of everything they touched. He smelled faintly of heavy starch and sharp peppermint. Behind Caldwell stood 2 massive men in dark suits, their hands resting neutrally in front of them. Muscle. Can I help you? Gavin asked, his voice steady. I had to give him credit. He was a phenomenal liar. Caldwell's eyes swept over Gavin, taking in the cheap apartment, the peeling paint, and the faint smell of burnt toast. A microscopic sneer touched the corner of the lawyer's mouth before vanishing into professional neutrality. I am looking for a young man, Caldwell said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the room. Someone who grew up in the county system. Someone who might possess a certain heirloom. Gavin didn't miss a beat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver Zippo. He didn't hand it over. He just held it up so the hallway light caught the engraved lion. You mean this? Gavin asked. Caldwell's eyes locked onto the lighter. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He didn't look relieved to have found the long-lost son. He looked relieved to have found his mark. May I come in? Caldwell asked. Gavin stepped aside. Of course, I'm Gavin. Gavin Montgomery, I suppose. Caldwell stepped into the cramped living room. He didn't even look at me. I was just part of the furniture, a roommate in the background. Mr. Montgomery, Caldwell said, rolling the name around in his mouth. My name is Richard Caldwell. I represent your biological father, Wallace Montgomery. He has spent a considerable amount of time and resources locating you. I always knew, Gavin lied, his voice thick with fake emotion. I always knew there was a reason I ended up with this. My mother. Did she? Your mother is not a topic of concern at the moment. Caldwell cut him off smoothly. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a black folder. Your father is an elderly man. His health is failing. He is anxious to integrate you into the family structure immediately. There are trusts to be signed, corporate titles to be transferred. You are to assume the role of executive director of Montgomery Holdings. Gavin's eyes practically bulged out of his head. Executive director? It is a formality, Caldwell said smoothly. Too smoothly. A matter of legacy. Of course, you will be heavily compensated. A signing bonus of $5 million will be deposited into a private account upon completion of the paperwork. And a penthouse on Fifth Avenue is already being staffed for you. $5 million, the bait on the hook. In my past life, that number had blinded me. I hadn't read the fine print. I hadn't seen the indemnification clauses, the assumption of pre-existing liabilities, the total transfer of legal culpability. Where do I sign? Gavin asked breathlessly. There will be time for that at the office, Caldwell said. We have a car waiting downstairs. We need to move quickly. The press cannot catch wind of this until the ink is dry. Can you leave immediately? Yes, Gavin said instantly. He didn't even glance back at his bedroom. He didn't look at his clothes. He didn't look at me. Excellent, Caldwell said. He gestured toward the door. Gavin walked toward the exit. He paused at the threshold and finally turned back to look at me. The expression on his face was a mix of triumph, pity, and sheer arrogance. He thought he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He thought he had stolen my golden ticket and left me in the dirt. I'll have my assistant send for my things, Gavin told Caldwell, though he was staring right at me, and cut a check for my former roommate, for his trouble. Former roommate. 3 years, erased in 3 minutes. Of course, sir, Caldwell murmured, though his eyes held a dead, bored indifference. Gavin turned and walked out into the hallway. The 2 massive bodyguards fell into step behind him. Caldwell lingered for just a second longer. He looked around the squalid apartment one last time, a look of profound disgust crossing his features, before pulling the door shut with a soft click. Silence descended on the apartment, the heavy, oppressive quiet of a bomb that had just been diffused. I stood alone in the center of the living room. I walked over to the window and pushed aside the dusty blinds. Down on the street, a massive black Lincoln town car was idling at the curb. I watched as Gavin slipped into the back seat, the door closing solidly behind him. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the morning traffic. He was gone. He was on his way to a penthouse that was bugged by the FBI. He was on his way to boardrooms filled with cartel lawyers. He was on his way to sign his life away for a debt he couldn't comprehend, to a syndicate that didn't negotiate. I let the blinds snap back into place. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just felt a deep, hollow exhaustion lifting from my bones. The phantom pain in my ribs finally ceased. I walked into the bedroom and pulled a canvas duffel bag from under the bed. I didn't pack much. Just 3 changes of clothes, my real Social Security card, and the $200 I had stashed inside a hollowed-out paperback book. I left Gavin's pristine suits hanging in the closet. I left the overdue bills on the counter. I left the burnt toast in the sink. I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked out the door, locking it behind me and dropping the key down the storm drain on the corner. The air outside smelled like exhaust fumes and rain. To me, It smelled like absolute freedom. The grease under my fingernails wouldn't wash out, no matter how hard I scrubbed with the abrasive orange pumice soap. It was baked into the cuticles, a permanent stain of my new reality. I dried my cracked hands on a shop towel that smelled intensely of industrial degreaser and old coffee. The garage around me, Miller's Auto, was a cavernous, drafty cinder block building on the industrial edge of the city. It was loud. An air compressor shrieked in the corner, masking the rhythmic, hollow clanking of a socket wrench dropping onto concrete. It wasn't glamorous. It was minimum wage, paid in cash every Friday by a grizzled man named Miller, who didn't ask for a last name or a social security card. It was perfect. I had been dead to the world for exactly 90 days. The transition hadn't been a cinematic montage of reinvention. It had been brutal, exhausting, and paralyzing in its banality. I slept on a foam mattress in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. I woke up at 5 a.m, my joints aching from the damp chill, and walked 2 miles in the freezing rain to change brake pads and flush transmissions. But every time I felt the ache in my lower back, I pressed 2 fingers to my lower left ribs. Solid bone, no fractures, no internal bleeding. I walked into the cramped, glass-walled office at the front of the shop to clock out for lunch. Miller was sitting behind a desk, buried in greasy invoices, tearing into a foil-wrapped meatball sub. Next to his elbow, a small, static-filled portable TV was tuned to a local midday news broadcast. I poured myself a cup of the tar-like coffee from the communal pot and glanced at the screen. There he was. Gavin filled the frame, stepping out of a glossy black SUV in front of a towering glass and steel high-rise. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. His hair was immaculately swept back. He flashed a brilliant, rehearsed smile at the cluster of paparazzi waiting on the sidewalk. Beside him, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane, was Wallace Montgomery. The billionaire looked frail, his skin papery and translucent under the harsh camera flashes. But his grip on Gavin's arm was tight, possessive. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Montgomery, heir apparent to take CEO mantle." "Lucky bastard," Miller mumbled, around a mouthful of bread and marinara, gesturing at the screen with a greasy finger. Kid gets plucked out of nowhere, handed the keys to half the skyline. Wish my old man was a secret billionaire instead of a degenerate gambler. "Yeah," I said quietly, taking a sip of the scalding bitter coffee. It burned the roof of my mouth. "Real lucky." I watched Gavin wave to the cameras. He looked invincible. He was soaking up the adulation, entirely blind to the invisible strings attached to his expensive new limbs. I knew exactly what his life looked like right now. The penthouse overlooking the park, the thread count of the Egyptian cotton sheets, the tasting menus at restaurants where you had to book a table a year in advance. I had lived it. I also knew what was sitting in the polished oak desk of his new corner office. The ledgers. The Montgomery Empire wasn't built on real estate. It was built on a shell game. Wallace bought distressed commercial properties at a premium, funneling hundreds of millions of offshore cartel money through the purchase orders, cleaning it through inflated renovation costs and dummy contracting firms. It was a beautiful, highly illegal machine, and it was currently running a massive deficit. The cartel had advanced Wallace $80 million for a waterfront development project that the city council had suddenly, unexpectedly, zoned as protected wetlands. The money was gone, trapped in worthless, unbuildable dirt. In my past life, it took me 6 months to figure out the discrepancy. When I confronted Wallace, he smiled, patted my cheek, and showed me the corporate restructuring documents I had blindly signed on my first day. I was the sole legal guarantor of the development firm. The debt belonged to me. Gavin didn't read fine print. Gavin barely read parking signs. He was too busy looking at his own reflection in the glass doors of his new kingdom to realize the foundation was wired with explosives. I finished my coffee, the dark dregs leaving a gritty film on my teeth. "See you tomorrow, Miller," I said, tossing the paper cup into the trash. I stepped out into the damp, gray afternoon. The chill cut right through my thin canvas jacket. I pulled my collar up and began the long walk back to my boarding house. I didn't feel jealousy as I thought of Gavin's charcoal suit. I felt the cold, hard weight of anticipation. The honeymoon phase was ending. The audits were coming. 4 months into Gavin's reign, the cracks finally began to show. I was no longer sleeping on a foam mattress. I had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. It smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and fresh paint. There were no roaches. There was a deadbolt on the door that actually clicked into place with a satisfying, heavy thud. I sat at a cheap folding table in the center of the sparse living room, the glow of a refurbished laptop illuminating the dark space. I had spent the last 16 weeks saving every dime I made at the garage, eating canned soup, and walking to work. I had scraped together exactly $4,200. It was a pathetic amount of money in the grand scheme of things. But in the options trading market, if you knew exactly what was going to happen, it was enough. I stared at the stock ticker for Montgomery Holdings, MGH. It was trading comfortably at $142 a share. The financial talking heads loved Gavin. He was young, aggressive, and provided fantastic sound bites. The stock had surged on his appointment, but I knew the date. October 14th. In exactly 3 days, a highly respected independent journalism outlet was going to publish a leaked document from the city's zoning board, heavily implying that Montgomery Holdings had attempted to bribe 2 councilmen to reverse the wetlands decision. The bribe had failed, but the paper trail was sloppy. It wouldn't bring down the company. Wallace had enough lawyers to bury the story eventually, but it would cause a momentary, violent panic in the market. I routed my cash into an untraceable brokerage account I had set up under a synthetic identity. My mouse hovered over the buy button. I was purchasing short-term put options, essentially betting that the stock would take a massive nosedive by the end of the week. I was leveraging everything I had. If I was wrong, I was back to zero. My hand trembled slightly. The plastic of the mouse felt slick under my sweaty palm. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the lemon wax. I wasn't just relying on memory. I was relying on the arrogance of Wallace Montgomery, a man who believed he was untouchable. I clicked buy. The money vanished from my account. I closed the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. 2 days later, I was standing in the break room at the garage when the news broke. The small television was playing a financial news network. The banner at the bottom flashed red. Montgomery Holdings plunges 18% on bribery allegations. A live feed showed Gavin stepping out of a restaurant downtown. He looked different. The pristine veneer was slipping. His tie was slightly askew. A reporter shoved a microphone into his face, shouting a question about the zoning board. Gavin froze. For a fraction of a second, the mask dropped entirely. I saw his eyes dart wildly from the microphone to the camera lens. He licked his dry lips. Then, his default defense mechanism kicked in. Belligerence. "This is a baseless smear campaign," Gavin snapped, his voice shrill, entirely lacking the polished baritone he had been practicing. He shoved past the reporter, his hand colliding roughly with the camera lens. "Get out of my way." He piled into his waiting car, slamming the door. I pulled out my phone and checked my brokerage account. The put options had exploded in value as the stock tanked. My $4,000 was now sitting at a clean $85,000. I immediately sold the contracts and initiated the transfer to my offshore account. I had my seed money. I was officially in the game, but as I watched the replay of Gavin shoving the camera, a cold, heavy sensation settled in my stomach. I knew what the stock dip meant. It wasn't just a loss of public face. The cartel monitored the market obsessively. A steep drop in stock value meant the front company was losing liquidity. It meant the SEC might start poking around. The cartel hated attention, and they violently despised financial instability. They wouldn't call Wallace about this. They wouldn't send a sternly worded email. In my past life, this was the exact moment the phone in my pocket had rung. A blocked number, a quiet, heavily accented voice telling me that I owed them $80 million and that the interest was accruing at 5% a month. I walked out of the break room, the smell of grease and rubber suddenly nauseating. I realized, with a jarring clarity, that Gavin was currently sitting in the back of his luxury SUV, staring at his ringing phone, completely unaware that he was about to answer a call from hell. The rain fell in sheets, washing the grime from the city streets and turning the neon signs into blurred, bleeding streaks of red and blue across the wet asphalt. I sat in a dimly lit booth in the back of an upscale, old-school steakhouse on the west side. It was the kind of place that smelled of rich mahogany, aged scotch, and charred ribeye. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the sound of the storm outside. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the warmth spread down my throat. It was my first luxury in half a year. I had earned it. The $85,000 had already been moved into a series of shell LLCs I had established in Delaware. I wasn't going to buy a sports car or a flashy watch. I was going to buy anonymity. I was building a fortress, brick by legal brick. My burner phone vibrated against the polished wood of the table. A single, harsh buzz. I set my glass down. The ice clinked against the rim. I picked up the cheap plastic device and opened the encrypted messaging app. The message was from a man I only knew as Leo. In my previous doomed existence, Leo was the low-level fixer Wallace employed to handle the dirty logistics, moving cash, disposing of evidence, intimidation. I had tracked him down a week ago using an anonymous email relay, offering him a flat $1,000 in cryptocurrency for a single piece of information: the location of Montgomery Holdings' primary logistics warehouse. The message on the screen was short. Pier 44, midnight. Check the local news. I looked at my watch. It was 11:45 p.m. I paid my tab, leaving a generous tip, and walked out into the freezing rain. I didn't hail a cab. I walked 3 blocks to a parking garage, climbed up to the open-air roof, and stood near the concrete ledge, looking east toward the shipping docks. The wind whipped at my jacket, freezing the rain against my skin, but I didn't move. I stared into the dark expanse of the harbor. At exactly midnight, a low, concussive thud rolled across the city. It was a physical sensation, a vibration that traveled through the concrete beneath my boots. A second later, a massive fireball erupted into the night sky over the docks. The flames were blindingly bright against the low-hanging clouds, a violently beautiful column of orange and red that greedily chewed through the darkness. Thick, black smoke began to billow upward, instantly caught and shredded by the coastal wind. Even from 3 miles away, after a few minutes, I could smell it. The sharp, acrid stench of burning rubber, chemical accelerants, and ozone. Pier 44, the primary storage facility for Montgomery Holdings, imported construction materials. My chest tightened. My hand instinctively went to my left side, pressing hard against my ribs. I closed my eyes, and the memories slammed into me with the force of a freight train. I remembered standing in front of those exact flames in my past life. I remembered the heat blistering my face, the absolute, paralyzing terror locking my knees. I remembered Caldwell standing next to me, his face impassive in the orange glow, telling me that this was just a warning, that the cartel was displeased with my management of the funds. I opened my eyes. I was on a cold, safe roof. I was untouchable. But Gavin, I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. Gavin was likely being dragged out of bed right now. The fire department would call him as the CEO on record. He would have to stand in the mud and the ashes, watching millions of dollars of uninsured inventory burn to the ground. He would have to talk to the arson investigators while his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket with calls from blocked numbers. He had wanted the crown. He had begged to take the pressure. He had looked at me with pity and arrogance, convinced I was too weak to carry the weight of an empire. Carry it now, Gavin, I thought, my breath pluming in the freezing air. He had stolen my identity to take a fortune, entirely blind to the fact that he was actually standing in front of a firing squad. The first shot had just been fired, and I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that the cartel did not miss twice. I turned my back on the burning sky, walked down the concrete stairwell, and disappeared into the shadows of the city. My new apartment smelled of cheap drip coffee and the ozone tang of an overheating hard drive. It was 3:02 a.m., 3 days after the fire at Pier 44. I sat in the dark, the harsh blue light of 2 monitors casting long, skeletal shadows across the bare walls. I had paid Leo, the Montgomery fixer, $35,000 for a backdoor login to the executive suite's closed-circuit security feeds. It was a staggering amount of money, nearly half of my remaining capital, but Leo was a mercenary. He saw the ship sinking, and he was already selling off the lifeboats. I rubbed my eyes, the grit of exhaustion scratching at my corneas. I clicked the mouse, bringing up the camera feed for the CEO's private office. There was Gavin. He was alone, slumped over the massive mahogany desk. The pristine, tailored charcoal suit he had worn on television was gone, replaced by a crumpled white dress shirt. The top 3 buttons were undone. His tie lay discarded on the floor like a dead snake. Even through the grainy, silent feed, I could see the frantic, ragged rise and fall of his chest. His phone was ringing. The little light on the receiver flashed a rhythmic, angry red. Gavin stared at it. He didn't reach for it. He just stared, his hands buried in his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive pomade. He looked like a man watching a venomous spider crawl across his pillow. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the glass of the monitor. I knew who was calling. In my previous life, that blinking red light had been the drumbeat of my execution. It was a man named Victor. Victor didn't leave voicemails. He didn't send emails. If you didn't answer, he simply escalated the physical reality of his displeasure. Pier 44 had been a warning. The next step wouldn't be property damage. On the screen, Gavin finally snatched the receiver. He pressed it to his ear. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. I watched Gavin's face drain of color, turning a sickly, fluorescent gray. His jaw worked silently. He shook his head wildly, his free hand gripping the edge of the desk so hard, his knuckles protruded like polished stones. He was probably stuttering out excuses, explaining about the wetlands zoning, begging for an extension. He abruptly slammed the phone down, knocking over a crystal tumbler. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward, and began to pace the length of the office. He looked trapped, a cornered animal in a glass cage, suspended 50 stories above the city. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't pity. It was the phantom echo of my own trauma. My ribs ached, a psychosomatic throb that made me wince and press my palm into my side. I hated that he still had that power over me. I hated that watching him suffer didn't feel like the triumphant, cinematic victory I had envisioned. It just felt dirty. The security feed flickered. The heavy oak door to Gavin's office swung open. Richard Caldwell stepped into the room. He looked immaculate, unbothered, carrying a slim leather folder. Gavin rushed him, his hands waving frantically, his mouth moving in rapid, desperate syllables. I watched Caldwell's reaction. It was a masterclass in sociopathic detachment. The lawyer didn't flinch. He simply held up a single, manicured hand, stopping Gavin in his tracks. Caldwell opened the folder, withdrew a single sheet of paper, and laid it on the mahogany desk. He tapped it twice with his index finger. It was a resignation letter, not Gavin's, Wallace Montgomery's. Even without audio, I knew the script. Caldwell was explaining that the patriarch's health had taken a sudden, severe turn. Wallace was stepping down from the board entirely, liquidating his personal shares into a blind trust, and severing all legal ties to Montgomery Holdings. The timing was perfectly coordinated with the cartel's collection cycle. Gavin was now the sole, undisputed captain of a ship that was already underwater. On the screen, Gavin grabbed Caldwell by the lapels of his suit. It was a stupid, desperate move. Caldwell didn't fight back. He just stared at Gavin with eyes like dead black stones until Gavin let go, stepping back in horror. Caldwell smoothed his tie, turned on his heel, and walked out, leaving the door wide open. Gavin sank to the floor, his back sliding down the glass wall, overlooking the glittering city. He pulled his knees to his chest. I reached out and clicked the monitor off. The room plunged back into darkness. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I leaned back in my cheap, squeaking chair and closed my eyes. The trap had snapped shut. Gavin had willingly placed his head in the guillotine, blinded by the shine of the blade. But my job wasn't done. If the cartel tore Gavin apart and liquidated Montgomery Holdings, the federal authorities would swarm the wreckage. They would dig into the company's history. They would find the falsified orphanage records. They would find me. I couldn't just let Gavin die. I had to buy the debt. I had to become the monster in the dark. I opened my eyes, the resolve hardening in my chest, heavy and cold as lead. I opened my encrypted browser and typed out a message to the only contact I had left. Tell Victor I want a meeting. Tomorrow night. I know where Wallace hid the Cayman routing numbers. I hit send. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. The parking garage beneath the financial district was a cathedral of concrete and fluorescent lighting. It smelled of stale exhaust, damp dust, and copper. I stood by the concrete pillar in Section 4C. I wasn't wearing a suit. I wore a heavy black pea coat, thick boots, and leather gloves. I looked like a dock worker who had wandered into the wrong tax bracket. I kept my hands shoved deep in my pockets, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, textured grip of a can of industrial pepper spray. It was a pathetic, laughable defense against the men I was meeting. But I needed the tactile sensation of a weapon to keep my knees from buckling. A sleek, black Audi rolled down the ramp, its tires hissing against the slick concrete. It stopped 20 feet away. The headlights cut and died, leaving only the buzzing, jaundiced glow of the overhead fluorescence. The back door opened. Victor stepped out. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my throat. He looked exactly the same broad, sloping shoulders of a retired heavyweight boxer, the same brutal flat nose that had been broken and reset half a dozen times, the same tailored charcoal overcoat that failed to hide the sheer, terrifying mass of the man. He didn't have a baseball bat this time. He didn't need one. His presence was a weapon. "You are the one sending messages to Leo," Victor said. His voice was a low, rumbling baritone, thickly coated in a Slavic accent. It echoed off the concrete. "I am," I said. I forced my voice to remain steady, locking my jaw so my teeth wouldn't chatter. Victor walked slowly toward me. The hollow clack of his expensive leather shoes against the pavement sounded like a metronome, counting down the last seconds of my life. He stopped 5 feet away, invading my space, forcing me to look up slightly to meet his dead, pale eyes. He smelled of menthol cigarettes and expensive aftershave. "Leo says you are a ghost," Victor murmured, tilting his head. "No name, no face, just a man with claims about Cayman routing numbers. Why should I not break your jaw right now and take your phone to see who you work for? Because if you break my jaw, you'll never find the 80 million Wallace Montgomery stole from you to cover his personal margin calls," I said. The lie slipped out smoothly, polished by weeks of rehearsal. "You think the money burned at Pier 44? You think it's tied up in the wetland zoning? It's not. Wallace siphoned it. He set up the kid, Gavin, to take the fall. Wallace is currently trying to move the cash to a non-extradition country." Victor's eyes narrowed. A flicker of genuine anger crossed his impassive face. The cartel hated incompetence, but they punished theft with medieval cruelty. "And how do you know this?" Victor asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I used to work for Caldwell." I lied again, leaning into the fiction. "I handled the digital transfers. When I saw Wallace setting up the kid, I backed up the ledgers and walked away. I have the account numbers, the shell company names, and the passwords to the private servers." "Give them to me." "No," I said. Victor moved so fast, my eyes barely registered the shift. His massive hand shot out, grabbing me by the throat, slamming me back against the concrete pillar. The air was violently forced from my lungs. My vision instantly swam with black spots. The rough concrete scraped the back of my skull. "I do not negotiate with ghosts," Victor snarled, his hot breath washing over my face. The smell of menthol was overpowering. "You give me the numbers, or I crush your windpipe and leave you in the trunk of a stolen car." I didn't reach for the pepper spray. I didn't claw at his hand. I forced myself to go limp, staring directly into his pale eyes. I had died once. I knew the mechanics of it. That gave me a bizarre, terrifying leverage. "Kill me," I wheezed, the words grinding out of my constricted throat. "And the money vanishes forever. Wallace wins." Victor stared at me. He was searching for the bluff. He was looking for the trembling, pathetic fear he was used to seeing in the eyes of his victims. But I was looking at the man who had shattered my ribs, and all I felt was a cold, absolute exhaustion. Slowly, his grip loosened. He stepped back, letting me slide an inch down the pillar. I sucked in a massive, ragged breath, coughing violently, the taste of copper flooding my mouth. "What do you want?" Victor asked, adjusting the cuffs of his overcoat. "I want the debt," I rasped, rubbing my bruised throat. "I want you to sign over Montgomery Holdings' $80 million liability to one of my LLCs. You sell it to me for 10 cents on the dollar. $8 million in clean cryptocurrency, transferred to you right now. In exchange, I give you the Cayman routing numbers to recover your full $80 million from Wallace's personal stash." Victor frowned, doing the math in his head. "You want to buy a dead company's debt? Why? The company is bankrupt. The kid running it is an idiot. Because Montgomery Holdings owns the air rights to a dozen commercial properties downtown," I said, reciting the financial reality I had uncovered in my past life. "The cartel doesn't want the properties. You just want your cash. But I can liquidate those assets. I can gut the company and make a fortune. But I need to be the primary creditor. I need Gavin Montgomery to owe me, not you." Victor stared at me for a long time. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, extracted a thin menthol, and lit it with a heavy gold lighter. The smoke plumed in the damp air. "You want to ruin the kid," Victor stated flatly. It wasn't a question. He recognized the specific, venomous geometry of a personal vendetta. "I want my money," I corrected him. "What happens to the kid is irrelevant." Victor took a long drag of the cigarette. The cherry burned a bright, violent orange in the dim garage. "Send the $8 million to the wallet address I text you," Victor said. "When the transfer clears, I will email you the assignment of debt. The cartel washes its hands of Montgomery Holdings. The kid is yours. But if the Cayman numbers you give me are fake—" "They aren't." "Good." Victor dropped the cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it beneath his heel. He turned and walked back to the Audi. "Do not let me see your face again, Ghost." The car doors slammed. The Audi sped up the ramp and disappeared into the night. I stood alone in the parking garage, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean against the pillar to keep from collapsing. I reached into my coat, pulled out my phone, and initiated the crypto transfer I had pre-programmed. The $8 million, the entirety of my options trading profits, vanished into the ether. I had just spent every dime I had to buy my own execution warrant. A minute later, my phone buzzed. An encrypted file arrived in my inbox. Deed of assignment, liability transfer. I opened the document. The language was dense, but the conclusion was absolute. The offshore syndicate had legally, quietly, transferred the massive, crushing weight of the Montgomery debt to an anonymous LLC registered in Delaware. My LLC. I didn't owe the cartel anymore. Gavin owed me. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the Montgomery Holdings building, but the sky was still a bruised, ugly purple. I walked past the security desk in the lobby. The guards didn't stop me, My Delaware LLC was now the majority shareholder of the company's debt. I owned the building, the desks, the polished marble floors, and the salaries of the men standing at the turnstiles. I swiped a temporary access card. I had forced the CFO to issue me an hour prior. The elevator ride to the 50th floor was agonizingly slow. The soft, instrumental jazz playing through the speakers felt like a mockery of the violence churning in my chest. I stared at my reflection in the polished brass doors. I looked older. The softness of the boy who had ironed Gavin's slacks was gone, replaced by a hollow, rigid mask. The doors chimed and slid open. The executive floor was deserted. The secretaries and junior partners had fled days ago when the rumors of bankruptcy started circulating. The plush carpets absorbed the sound of my boots as I walked down the long, glass-lined hallway toward the CEO's corner office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The office was a disaster. The mahogany desk was buried under mountains of legal files, foreclosure notices, and empty coffee cups. The air smelled foul, a mixture of sour sweat, stale whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of sheer panic. Gavin was sitting on the floor behind the desk. He didn't look up when I walked in. He was holding a pair of silver scissors, mindlessly shredding a glossy corporate brochure into tiny, jagged strips. His suit jacket was gone. His shirt was stained with spilled coffee. He hadn't shaved in days. A patchy dark scruff covered his jawline, making him look gaunt and feral. "I told security no one comes up here," Gavin muttered, his voice raspy and thin. He didn't lift his eyes from the scissors. "Tell the banks I need until Monday. Tell them my father he's coming back. He has to." "He isn't coming back, Gavin." The scissors stopped. Gavin froze. Slowly, agonizingly, he tilted his head up. His bloodshot, sunken eyes locked onto my face. For a long, silent moment, his brain simply refused to process what he was seeing. He blinked, rapidly, as if trying to clear a hallucination. "Rowan?" he whispered. The name sounded like a dying breath. "Hello, Gavin." I walked over to the leather guest chair, picked up a discarded suit jacket, tossed it onto the floor, and sat down. I crossed my legs, resting my hands on my knees. I looked at him. Really looked at him. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive joy, a fiery rush of triumph. Instead, I just felt a cold, clinical disgust. He looked so small. "What are you doing here?" Gavin scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the glass window. He gripped the edge of the desk and hauled himself up, swaying slightly on his feet. "How did you get past security? Did the press send you? Because if you talk to them, if you tell them about the lighter—" "I didn't come to talk to the press," I interrupted softly. I reached into my peacoat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the center of the ruined mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. Gavin flinched. He stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. "What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "That is a ledger," I said. "It details exactly $80 million in missing syndicate funds. Money that Wallace Montgomery laundered through this company, lost in bad investments, and then legally anchored to the title of CEO." Gavin's face contorted in confusion, then terror. "Syndicate? Cartel? What are you talking about? It's just a real estate deficit. The banks. Caldwell said the banks would negotiate." "Caldwell lied to you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. Caldwell brought you in to be a human shield. You aren't a CEO, Gavin. You're a goat tied to a stake in the middle of a tiger enclosure. Gavin shook his head frantically. He lunged forward, grabbing the envelope, tearing it open. He pulled out the documents, his eyes scanning the dense financial jargon. His breath came in short, hyperventilating gasps as he read the indemnification clauses, the liability transfers, the signature lines that bore his own frantic, looping handwriting. "No," Gavin gasped. "No, this is illegal. They can't do this. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them Wallace set me up." "Wallace is gone," I stated. "And the people you owe this money to don't care about the police. They care about their $80 million. They burned Pier 44 to send you a message. Tomorrow, they were going to send a man named Victor to break your legs. And when you still couldn't pay, they were going to put a bullet in your head." Gavin dropped the papers. They scattered across the desk, sliding onto the floor. He looked at me, the arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only naked, pathetic terror. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over his dark, bruised lower lids. "Rowan, please," Gavin choked out, his knees buckling slightly. "You have to help me. You knew this was a trap, didn't you? That's why you didn't want the lighter." "I knew," I admitted, the truth hanging in the stale air between us. "But you were so eager to steal it. You wanted the penthouse. You wanted to be the king." "I'll give it back," Gavin cried, lunging around the desk. He fell to his knees in front of my chair, grabbing the fabric of my coat with trembling hands. "I'll sign it all back to you. The title, the company, everything. Just take it. Please, Rowan. They're going to kill me." I looked down at his hands, clutching my coat. I remember those hands snapping their fingers in my face, demanding I iron his pants. I remembered those hands pocketing my birth certificate. I reached down and pried his fingers off my coat, pushing him back. "I don't want the title, Gavin," I said quietly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second, thinner folder. I dropped it on his chest. "I want the company." Gavin scrambled backward, clutching the folder. He opened it. "What is this?" he whispered. "That is a transfer of assets," I explained, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "As of 2 hours ago, my holding company purchased the entirety of Montgomery Holdings' debt from the cartel. I paid them off. They are out of the picture. They aren't coming to kill you." Gavin's eyes widened. A massive, hysterical wave of relief washed over his face. He let out a wet, shuddering laugh, covering his face with his hands. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Rowan, you saved me. You actually saved me." "I didn't save you," I said, my voice cutting through his relief like a scalpel. The laughter died in his throat. He lowered his hands, looking at me with dawning horror. "The cartel is gone," I continued smoothly, "but the debt didn't disappear. It just transferred. You don't owe them $80 million anymore, Gavin. You owe me $80 million. Gavin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "And I am calling the debt due today." I pointed at the folder in his lap. "You are going to sign that document. It transfers all voting rights, all physical assets, all air rights, and all liquid capital of Montgomery Holdings directly to my LLC. It strips you of the CEO title. It strips you of the penthouse. It leaves you with exactly what you had when you walked out of our apartment." "Nothing," Gavin whispered, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "Worse than nothing," I corrected him, Because the document also stipulates that while I take the assets, the personal criminal liability for the money laundering remains entirely in your name. When the SEC and the FBI finally raid this building next month, they won't find a cartel. They'll just find a greedy, incompetent fraud who signed his name to 50 counts of federal wire fraud. You can't do this, Gavin begged, his voice cracking. He crawled toward me, his hands reaching out again. Rowan, please. We were family. We grew up together. I loved you. The contradiction in my chest flared, a brief, agonizing pang of the old affection I used to harbor for him. But I looked at his desperate, lying eyes, and the ghost of my fractured ribs throbbed a final time, killing the sentiment instantly. You didn't love me, Gavin, I said, standing up. I towered over him as he knelt on the plush carpet. You loved what I could do for you. Now, sign the paper, or I tear it up and I call Victor back. Gavin flinched at the name. He looked at the document, then at me, then at the sprawling, glittering city outside the window, a kingdom he had ruled for less than a year. With shaking, violently trembling hands, he pulled a gold pen from the floor. He opened the folder. He didn't read it. He just pressed the pen to the signature line and scrawled his name, the ink bleeding into the heavy paper. He handed the folder up to me, his head bowed, sobbing quietly into his chest. I took the folder. I didn't say thank you. I didn't gloat. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. What am I supposed to do now? Gavin cried out behind me, his voice echoing in the vast, empty office. Where am I supposed to go? I paused at the threshold. I didn't turn around. There's a garage on the west side, I said quietly. They're hiring a mechanic. Ask for Miller. Tell him you need cash. I walked out of the office, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me, sealing Gavin inside his empty glass tomb. The elevator ride down felt different. The air was lighter. The crushing weight that had sat on my chest since the moment I woke up in that cramped apartment was finally gone. I stepped out into the lobby, the deed to an empire tucked under my arm, and walked out into the cold, cleansing rain. I was alive, and this time, the life was entirely mine. Are you ready for more revenge and redemption? If you loved watching Rowan turn the tables and build his empire from the ashes, smash that like button and share this story with someone who loves a dark, satisfying plot twist. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below. Did Gavin get exactly what he deserved? Or was Rowan too cold in the end? What would you have done? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next video.